No one noticed him at first. That was the most dangerous thing about him. On paper, he was just another immigrant scientist, soft-spoken, slightly hunched, carrying a leather briefcase worn thin at the edges. He walked the same hallways as hundreds of others, passed the same guards, signed the same security logs, and drank the same bitter government-issued coffee. His name appeared on payroll sheets, research memos, and internal directories. Nothing about him suggested betrayal. Yet, somewhere between the desert laboratories of New Mexico and the echoing corridors of Washington, America's most powerful secret was slipping through invisible cracks. The Cold War had no opening ceremony. It did not begin with a declaration or a single gunshot. It arrived quietly, like frost creeping across glass, and by the time the world noticed, the damage was already done. In the late 1940s, the United States stood alone atop a terrifying mountain. It possessed the atomic bomb, and for a brief moment in history, that knowledge made America untouchable. That illusion did not last. By 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic device. The shockwaves were not just physical. They tore through Washington's intelligence community, rattled military planners, and sent a single question echoing through the Pentagon and the White House alike. How did they catch up so fast? The answer would take decades to fully understand, and at the center of it was a man who vanished. To grasp how the greatest intelligence breach of the 20th century became possible, one must return to a time when fear justified everything. In the summer of 1942, the United States embarked on a project so secret that even Vice President Harry Truman did not know it existed. It was called the Manhattan Project, a name deliberately chosen to sound mundane. In reality, it was the largest scientific undertaking in human history, drawing together physicists, chemists, engineers, mathematicians, soldiers, and industrial workers across multiple states. Its goal was singular: build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could. Security was strict, but it was also improvised. There was no historical blueprint for protecting a secret of this magnitude. The Office of Scientific Research and Development worked alongside the Army Corps of Engineers, while the newly empowered FBI attempted background checks on tens of thousands of personnel. Speed was everything. Corners were cut. Assumptions were made. Many scientists were European refugees, brilliant minds who had fled fascism, persecution, and war. They were welcomed, even celebrated. Their politics, associations, and private beliefs were rarely questioned too deeply. After all, they had escaped tyranny. Why would they betray their savior? That assumption would prove catastrophic. By 1945, the atomic bomb was no longer theoretical. It had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending World War II and ushering in a new era of power defined not by armies but by equations. And while Americans celebrated victory, another war quietly began. The Soviet Union, devastated by the conflict, yet determined never again to be vulnerable, turned its full attention to nuclear parity. Stalin understood that without the bomb, the USSR would forever remain at America's mercy. He did not ask his scientists whether it could be done. He demanded it. And he activated one of the most sophisticated espionage networks ever assembled. American intelligence underestimated the Soviet system. Unlike traditional spies romanticized in fiction, Soviet intelligence operated on patience, ideology, and deep infiltration. Agents were not sent to steal documents and flee. They were planted to live normal lives, build careers, gain trust, and wait, years if necessary. The United States, flush with post-war confidence, failed to recognize how vulnerable it truly was. By 1946, atomic research had shifted from wartime secrecy to peacetime bureaucracy. Laboratories reopened under civilian oversight. Universities partnered with government agencies. The Atomic Energy Commission replaced military control, dispersing responsibility across committees and administrators. It was here, within the tangle of red tape and academic freedom, that the spy truly disappeared into plain sight. He was not introduced with fanfare. There was no dramatic recruitment scene, no whispered oath in a candlelit room. His journey began years earlier, across an ocean, shaped by war, displacement, and belief. Born in Europe between two world wars, he had grown up watching empires collapse and ideologies clash. Fascism had taken friends and family. Capitalism, to him, seemed indifferent to suffering. Communism, whatever its flaws, promised equality and resistance against tyranny. By the time he arrived in America, his loyalties were already divided. He studied physics not because he loved destruction, but because he believed knowledge should belong to humanity, not monopolized by a single nation. That belief, nurtured carefully by Soviet handlers, became the justification for betrayal. He did not see himself as a traitor, he saw himself as a corrector of imbalance. The first documents he passed were modest, technical clarifications, theoretical discussions, nothing that would trigger alarms if discovered. Soviet intelligence was cautious. They tested him, measured his reliability, and ensured he was not a double agent. Years passed. Then the war ended, and the real transfer began. Design schematics, implosion models, critical mass calculations, metallurgical challenges surrounding plutonium cores. Each detail shaved years off Soviet research timelines. Americans assumed that even if espionage occurred, it could not replace experimentation. They were wrong. Nuclear physics was unforgiving, but once certain thresholds were crossed, progress accelerated exponentially. By the time American analysts realized the Soviets had detonated a bomb eerily similar to their own, the damage was irreversible. But the spy was still there, still attending meetings, still publishing sanitized papers, still shaking hands with colleagues who trusted him with their lives and the future of their nation. What made him especially dangerous was not access alone, but interpretation. He did not merely steal documents, he explained them, he contextualized data, he anticipated questions Soviet scientists would face and provided answers before they were asked. In intelligence terms, he was not a courier, he was a multiplier. Suspicion, when it finally arose, came from an unexpected direction, not from a missing file or a broken safe, but from mathematics. In 1949, after the Soviet test, American scientists studying fallout debris noticed something unsettling. The isotopic signatures suggested design choices too precise to be coincidence. Someone, somewhere, had guided them. The FBI reopened old security files. Names were reviewed, backgrounds re-examined. Associations once dismissed as harmless suddenly carried weight. But evidence was elusive. The spy had been careful. He avoided written communication. He used dead drops, coded language, and intermediaries. He never possessed classified documents outside secure facilities. Everything he transmitted had passed through memory first, and memory leaves no fingerprints. As investigations intensified, pressure mounted. Careers were destroyed. Innocent scientists were questioned, surveilled, and ostracized. Loyalty hearings swept through laboratories and universities, feeding the growing paranoia of the Red Scare. The spy watched it all unfold. He understood that the net was tightening, and he made a decision. One morning, he did not arrive at work. At first, no one noticed. Absences were common. Conferences, illnesses, personal leave. It was an era of paperwork delays and slow communication. But days passed, then weeks. His apartment was empty, bank accounts untouched, no farewell letters, no witnesses, no trace. American intelligence panicked. Had he defected, been extracted, killed, or had they misjudged everything? The truth would remain buried for years. What investigators did not understand was that the disappearance was not the end of the operation. It was the final act. The spy had already given away the future, and America would spend the rest of the Cold War living in its shadow. The man who would one day unbalance the world was not born a spy. He was born into uncertainty. Europe, between the wars, was a continent haunted by unfinished grief. Borders shifted faster than identities, and governments rose and fell before children could understand their flags. In this fractured world, he grew up surrounded by contradiction, brilliance and brutality existing side by side. His father believed in reason, his mother in survival. From both, he inherited silence. He learned early that speaking too much invited danger. As a boy, he excelled at numbers. Mathematics offered something politics never could: certainty. An equation did not care who ruled the country or what language was spoken. It either balanced or it did not. By his teenage years, physics followed naturally. The invisible forces of the universe fascinated him more than speeches or slogans. But history does not allow neutrality. When fascism spread across Europe, it did not announce itself as evil. It arrived dressed as order, discipline, and national pride. Universities were pressured. Colleagues disappeared. Jewish scientists, leftists, and intellectuals were purged or forced to flee. He watched mentors vanish from lecture halls, their names erased from records. By the time war came, idealism had already been crushed. The United States, across the ocean, appeared as a sanctuary. It offered laboratories instead of battlefields, research grants instead of ration cards. When he secured passage, it felt less like immigration and more like escape. America welcomed him with cautious optimism. He was brilliant, disciplined, and politically quiet. He answered background questions carefully, never lying, but never offering more than required. He joined a generation of foreign-born scientists whose talents were desperately needed. The war justified everything. The Manhattan Project was not just a scientific endeavor, it was an administrative miracle built on improvisation. Entire cities appeared overnight. Los Alamos rose from desert emptiness into a hub of genius and secrecy. Oak Ridge processed uranium on an industrial scale never attempted before. Hanford bred plutonium beside the Columbia River. Each site operated with compartmentalization as its primary defense. Scientists were told only what they needed to know, or so administrators believed. But physics does not compartmentalize easily. A single equation could reveal the purpose of an entire facility. A conversation overheard in a cafeteria could connect theories into reality. And for those trained to see patterns, secrecy became porous. Security officers focused on loyalty, not understanding. They searched for overt communist sympathies, not quiet ideological alignment. Attendance at meetings, subscription to newspapers, old friendships, these became red flags. But deeper motivations were rarely examined. The spy learned quickly how to navigate this environment. He was helpful, but not outspoken, curious, but not intrusive. He volunteered for calculations others found tedious. He listened far more than he spoke. People trusted silence, and silence became his greatest weapon. Soviet intelligence did not recruit impulsively. Their operatives studied targets for years, sometimes decades. Recruitment was not about coercion, it was about alignment. The spy was approached not with threats, but with conversation, intellectual equality, moral reasoning. The argument was simple and dangerously persuasive. The atomic bomb had changed humanity forever. Allowing one nation to control it was irresponsible. Balance was not aggression, it was prevention. If the Soviet Union possessed the same knowledge, nuclear war might become unthinkable. He was not asked to steal, he was asked to share. At first he resisted, not because he feared consequences, but because he believed knowledge should remain scientific, not political. But ideology has a way of bending logic. Each conversation reframed responsibility.
Each news report of post-war tensions reinforced the narrative of inevitable conflict. Eventually, resistance gave way to rationalization. The first transmission was verbal. No documents, no physical evidence, just explanation, spoken quietly, remembered precisely, delivered carefully. Soviet handlers were impressed. After the war, the Atomic Energy Act transferred nuclear oversight from the military to civilian control. It was meant to signal transparency and democratic accountability. Instead, it fractured authority. Universities regained autonomy. Private contractors expanded their roles. Classified research spread across institutions with varying security standards. The FBI, already overstretched, struggled to keep pace. Background checks became outdated almost as soon as they were completed. The spy's access increased. He moved between facilities under legitimate pretenses. Conferences provided cover for information exchange. Academic collaboration normalized conversations that would once have been restricted. Each step forward seemed harmless in isolation. Together, they formed a breach no firewall could contain. He never carried papers out of secure areas. He memorized, he reconstructed it, he verified details through multiple sources to avoid errors. His transmissions were not hurried, they were curated. Soviet scientists trusted his accuracy because it proved correct again and again. The speed of Soviet progress astonished even their own leadership. American intelligence, meanwhile, was fighting the wrong war. The FBI focused on domestic communist organizations, labor unions, and political activism. Espionage within scientific circles remained an abstract fear rather than a targeted investigation. Scientists were seen as eccentric, not dangerous. When alarms finally sounded, they came from scientists themselves. The realization that the Soviet bomb mirrored American design was deeply unsettling. Coincidence could explain similarity, precision could not. Internal reviews were launched quietly to avoid public panic. Files were reopened, old interviews re-examined. Patterns were sought where none had been seen before. Names emerged. Some were innocent, some were careless, a few were suspicious. But suspicion is not proof. The spy sensed the shift long before it reached him directly. Conversations became guarded, security briefings intensified. Colleagues were called in for questioning, returning shaken and silent. He understood that history was accelerating. Disappearance is often imagined as dramatic. In reality, it is mundane. There was no chase, no airport standoff, no last-minute warning. One day, he simply altered his routine. A train ticket purchased under a legitimate excuse, a suitcase packed with nothing unusual, personal items left behind to avoid suspicion. He did not defect publicly. He did not announce his loyalty. He vanished into a system designed to absorb such movements. When American authorities realized he was gone, embarrassment compounded fear. To admit a successful escape was to admit failure at every level. Internally, theories multiplied. Some believed he had been quietly removed by Soviet intelligence. Others suspected he had never existed as imagined, that his role had been exaggerated by analysts desperate for answers. A darker theory suggested he had been allowed to disappear to avoid public scandal. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. He had planned his exit long before suspicion arose. Years later, declassified documents would reveal fragments of his impact. Timelines shortened, research obstacles eliminated, entire experimental pathways avoided. The Soviet nuclear program, once years behind, surged forward with unnatural efficiency. America responded with expansion, not introspection. More bombs, bigger bombs, hydrogen weapons, missile delivery systems. The arms race escalated, fueled by mutual fear and mutual misunderstanding. The spy never appeared again. No photographs, no memoirs, No confirmed sightings. He became a ghost, haunting intelligence briefings and academic conferences alike. But his legacy was tangible. Security protocols tightened, scientific openness narrowed, trust eroded. The golden age of collaborative physics gave way to compartmentalization and clearance levels. The price of secrecy became permanent. And the man who believed he was preventing catastrophe had instead ensured a future where annihilation became policy. History would not judge him kindly, but history rarely sees intentions, only outcomes.
The greatest mistake American intelligence made was assuming that fear would expose the spy. Fear, instead, concealed him. By the early 1950s, the United States had entered a period of internal suspicion unprecedented in its history. The Cold War was no longer theoretical, it was personal. Newspapers spoke of infiltration. Politicians warned of enemies within. Loyalty oaths became routine. Careers were destroyed not by proof, but by implication. This atmosphere, meant to protect the nation, achieved the opposite. The FBI expanded rapidly, but expansion did not bring clarity. Agents were pressured to produce results, not understanding. Communist Party membership became the primary metric of danger. Attendance at left-leaning meetings, signing petitions, or maintaining friendships with known activists could trigger investigation. The real spy had none of these vulnerabilities. He had never joined a party. He avoided political discussion. He donated to mainstream causes. He voted when required and stayed silent when not. To those profiling ideological threats, he appeared invisible. Instead, attention fell on louder targets. Several scientists were arrested, interrogated, and in some cases convicted. Some were guilty of espionage. Others were guilty only of poor judgment or unfortunate associations. Each arrest reassured the public that the system worked, but the system was chasing shadows. Inside the FBI, a small number of analysts suspected that something deeper had gone wrong. The speed of Soviet progress suggested not a single leak, but sustained high-level guidance. Yet proposing such a breach was politically dangerous. It implied systemic failure, an admission few were willing to make. Files piled up. Interviews contradicted one another. Informants exaggerated. Memories faded. What remained was noise, not signal. The CIA, still a young organization, fared no better. Jurisdictional rivalry hampered cooperation. Information was hoarded, not shared. Critical connections were lost in bureaucratic silos. The spy benefited from every weakness. Years after his disappearance, fragments of truth began to surface, not through confession, but through declassification. Internal Soviet records, released decades later, revealed how astonishingly precise their early nuclear work had been. Problems American scientists had struggled with for months were bypassed entirely. Experimental dead ends were avoided with uncanny accuracy. Someone had warned them. More than that, someone had taught them how to think about the bomb. The spy's greatest contribution was not data, but methodology. He translated American scientific culture itself, how problems were framed, how uncertainty was managed, how risk was calculated. That knowledge could not be reverse engineered. It had to be learned from within. In Washington, policy hardened. If secrecy had failed, then secrecy must become absolute. Security clearances multiplied. Background investigations expanded backward into childhoods. Foreign-born scientists found themselves under perpetual scrutiny. International collaboration slowed to a crawl. The unintended consequence was intellectual isolation. American science, once fueled by global exchange, narrowed. Innovation continued, but at greater cost. Creativity suffered under constant surveillance. Ironically, the very openness that had enabled the spy was also the source of American scientific dominance. By sealing itself off, the nation weakened one of its greatest strengths. The Cold War arms race accelerated regardless. Hydrogen bombs replaced atomic ones. Missiles replaced aircraft.
The scale of destruction multiplied beyond comprehension. Strategy shifted from victory to deterrence, from use to threat. Mutually assured destruction became doctrine. And beneath it all lay a secret no one wanted to confront. This balance had been shaped by theft. The spy, meanwhile, lived out his remaining years far from the spotlight. He did not rise to prominence. He did not lecture or advise publicly. He disappeared into anonymity, protected by the same system he had served. Soviet intelligence did not celebrate him openly. To acknowledge his role would invite questions they did not want answered. He became a classified footnote, known only to a handful of officials. His motivations, preserved in fragments of correspondence and second-hand accounts, remain debated. Some portray him as an ideologue, convinced that nuclear parity prevented war. Others describe a man haunted by guilt, aware that his actions had fueled an arms race he could not control. The truth likely contains both. History is rarely kind to those who act on belief alone. What remains undeniable is impact. Without his contributions, the Soviet nuclear program would have succeeded eventually, but later and at greater cost. That delay might have altered diplomatic calculations, military deployments, and political decisions at critical moments. Would the Cold War have been less dangerous? No one can say, but it would have been different. As the decades passed, his name faded. New crises replaced old fears. The Cold War ended not with nuclear fire, but with economic collapse and political reform. Yet the systems built in response to his betrayal remained. Security culture hardened permanently. Surveillance normalized. Trust became conditional. The spy who vanished did not just steal secrets, he changed how a nation thought about knowledge itself. In the end, he achieved what few individuals ever do. He altered the course of history without leaving a trace.
History has an uncomfortable habit of simplifying what was once complex. When the Cold War ended, Americans wanted clean conclusions, heroes and villains, victories and defeats. The spy who vanished did not fit neatly into any of these categories. He was neither paraded as a captured enemy nor condemned in a courtroom. Without a public reckoning, his story drifted into abstraction. Yet inside classified archives, his shadow lingered. As documents slowly emerged through declassification in the 1970s and 1980s, intelligence historians began assembling fragments of a picture long denied. They found references without names, operations without endings, and assessments written in cautious language designed to obscure as much as they revealed. What became clear was not just that espionage had occurred, but that it had been underestimated at every stage. The Manhattan Project's internal reviews, conducted quietly after the Soviet test, revealed a pattern of overconfidence. Security officers had believed that ideological screening was sufficient. They underestimated how belief could exist without membership, how loyalty could fracture without outward signs. The spy exploited that blind spot perfectly. Comparisons emerged inevitably. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg became the public face of nuclear espionage. Their trial, conviction, and execution offered closure, however controversial. Klaus Fuchs, the German-born physicist who confessed to passing atomic secrets, provided a clearer narrative: guilt acknowledged, punishment applied. But the spy who vanished was different. He left no confession, no courtroom transcript, no final statement. Unlike others, he had not been exposed by informants or surveillance. He had recognized the moment when probability turned against him and acted before suspicion hardened into accusation. This distinction mattered. It suggested a level of self-awareness and planning absent from many exposed spies. He was not reckless. He did not believe himself untouchable. He understood systems and how to exit them. Intelligence professionals would later study his disappearance as a case example in operational discipline. The deeper scholars dug, the more unsettling the implications became.
Internal memos revealed that some officials had suspected him but lacked proof. Others had raised concerns only to be overridden by superiors unwilling to disrupt ongoing research. The pressure to maintain momentum during and after the war had consistently outweighed caution. America had chosen speed over certainty. That choice had consequences. Cold War nuclear policy hardened partly because of uncertainty. If espionage could not be reliably detected, then worst-case assumptions became default. Military planners assumed parity sooner than expected. Diplomatic strategies adjusted accordingly. Every negotiation carried the unspoken awareness that the enemy might already know more than anticipated. This uncertainty fueled escalation. Each side raced not merely to build weapons, but to build them faster than the other could steal them. The spy had introduced a new variable into global strategy: invisible acceleration. On a personal level, the consequences were equally profound. Scientific communities fractured along lines of nationality and suspicion. Foreign-born researchers faced scrutiny that never fully receded. Even decades later, echoes remained in visa restrictions, clearance delays, and unspoken distrust. The openness that had once defined American science was replaced by guarded collaboration. In trying to protect itself, the nation had reshaped its identity. The spy himself aged quietly. Soviet records suggest he lived modestly, never fully reintegrated into public scientific life. Whether this was punishment, protection, or personal choice remains unclear. Intelligence services value silence, and he had proven capable of it. There were no medals, no public recognition, just obscurity. Some accounts describe him as increasingly withdrawn, burdened by the realization that his actions had contributed to a world perpetually on the brink of annihilation. Others portray a man convinced until the end that nuclear parity prevented catastrophe. Perhaps both are true. Human motivation is rarely singular. As the Cold War thawed and eventually collapsed, the relevance of his actions faded from public consciousness. New threats emerged, new technologies replaced old fears. But the legacy of nuclear espionage endured. Treaties were negotiated with layers of verification unimaginable in the 1940s. Inspections, monitoring systems, and mutual oversight became necessities rather than concessions. Trust, once assumed, now requires proof. In that sense, the spy's influence extended far beyond weapons. He changed how nations believed, or refused to believe, each other. History does not always grant endings. Sometimes it offers consequences instead. The spy who vanished never faced judgment, but his choices shaped decades of policy, fear, and restraint. His absence became a presence, a reminder that power, once revealed, cannot be reclaimed. The nuclear age had begun in secrecy. It matured in suspicion, and it would persist in caution.
With distance came arguments. As the Cold War receded into history, scholars, policymakers, and former intelligence officers began asking questions that had once been politically dangerous. They no longer debated whether espionage had occurred. That was settled. Instead, they argued over meaning. Was the spy a criminal, a traitor who endangered millions, or was he a realist, someone who believed that monopoly over nuclear weapons was itself an existential threat? The debate revealed more about the era than about the man. In the late 20th century, declassified hearings and memoirs painted a portrait of a government grappling with its own contradictions. America had built the bomb in secrecy, justified by fear of Nazi victory. After the war, it sought moral authority while retaining strategic dominance. When that dominance was challenged through espionage, outrage followed, but also denial. Accepting the full implications required humility few institutions possessed. Historians examining internal memoranda noticed a recurring pattern.
Warnings ignored not because they lacked merit, but because they disrupted progress. Scientists were too valuable to sideline. Projects were too urgent to delay. The bomb had become not just a weapon, but a symbol of national competence. Questioning access meant questioning trust, and questioning trust meant acknowledging vulnerability. The spy had understood this intuitively. He never challenged authority directly. He worked within systems, aligning himself with institutional priorities. Productivity shielded him. Competence made him indispensable. This lesson would echo through intelligence training manuals long after his disappearance. Moral analysis proved even more divisive. Some argued that his actions accelerated a dangerous arms race. By enabling Soviet parity, he intensified fear, militarization, and brinksmanship. Crises such as Berlin and Cuba unfolded in a world armed not with possibility, but with certainty of mutual destruction. Others countered that without parity, American nuclear monopoly might have been used coercively. They pointed to early war plans that contemplated preventive strikes and to rhetoric that framed atomic weapons as tools of policy rather than last resort. Parity, they claimed, forced restraint. The spy's legacy, in this view, was deterrence. Both arguments carried weight, neither could be proven. What complicated matters further was intent. Unlike mercenaries or coerced informants, the spy appeared motivated by belief rather than gain. He did not enrich himself. He did not seek power or recognition. His correspondence, sparse as it was, suggested a man convinced that he was acting in service of a larger equilibrium. Yet belief does not absolve consequence. The arms race consumed trillions of dollars, shaped foreign policy for generations, and left the world permanently altered. Entire regions became proxies. Lives were lost not to nuclear fire, but to conflict fueled by its shadow. The spy could not have foreseen all of this, but he helped make it possible. Former colleagues, when interviewed decades later, expressed a different kind of grief. They did not speak of betrayal in patriotic terms. Instead, they spoke of loss, of trust broken within a community built on shared pursuit of truth. Science, for them, had been a refuge from ideology. Discovering that it could be weaponized from within shattered that illusion. Some wondered aloud whether the system itself had failed the spy. Had it demanded secrecy incompatible with scientific openness? Had it forced moral choices onto individuals unequipped to bear them alone? These questions lingered without resolution. As archives opened further, the spy's disappearance came to symbolize something larger, the limits of accountability in a classified world. Justice requires exposure. Exposure requires admission, and admission threatens institutions. So the story remained fragmented. The absence of a trial allowed competing narratives to persist. Each generation projected its own fears and values onto the silhouette of the vanished man. He became less a person than a mirror. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson was institutional rather than moral. Nuclear weapons transformed espionage itself. Information became as lethal as explosives. Trust became a strategic liability. Knowledge, once shared to advance humanity, became currency in a zero-sum game. The spy operated at the precise moment when that transformation was incomplete, when openness and secrecy overlapped dangerously. He stepped into the gap, and then he was gone. History often remembers events, not absences, but sometimes absence tells the deeper story. The spy who stole America's nuclear secrets left no grave, no confession, no closure. What he left behind was a changed world, one where power was balanced by fear, and peace depended on the certainty that no one would ever again stand alone at the summit of destruction. That world still exists, and it was shaped, in part, by a man who walked quietly through guarded doors, carried nothing in his hands, and vanished before anyone realized what he had taken.
By the early 1960s, the world had learned to live with a permanent tremor beneath its feet. Nuclear weapons no longer shocked the imagination, they haunted it. Cities practiced evacuation drills, children learned to hide beneath desks. Military planners spoke casually of megatons and casualty projections that would once have been unthinkable. This normalization of the apocalypse did not arise spontaneously. It was the product of balance, an equilibrium forged in secrecy, theft, and fear. And at its center stood a reality made possible decades earlier. Two superpowers, armed equally, staring into the abyss. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not begin in October 1962. It began years earlier, in laboratories and briefing rooms, when American officials first accepted that nuclear monopoly was gone forever. That acceptance reshaped doctrine. Containment replaced dominance. Deterrence replaced victory. The spy who vanished had not planned this future, but his actions had accelerated its arrival. Soviet confidence in their nuclear capability emboldened strategic risk-taking. Without assured retaliation, placing missiles in Cuba would have been unthinkable. With parity, it became plausible. American intelligence, haunted by past blind spots, scrutinized every movement obsessively. Surveillance intensified, assumptions hardened, the margin for error narrowed dangerously. For 13 days, the world balanced on information, what was known, what was assumed, and what remained hidden. At that moment, nuclear espionage ceased to be an abstract history. It became an immediate threat. Declassified transcripts reveal how deeply fear of hidden knowledge shaped decision-making. Advisors worried not just about weapons, but about what the Soviets might already understand regarding American response capabilities. Trust had been permanently eroded. Every option was weighed against worst-case assumptions. Could Moscow anticipate a strike? Could Washington miscalculate Soviet resolve? Each question echoed back to the same uncertainty that had emerged after the first Soviet test. Someone had known too much. When the crisis ended without war, relief followed, but not reassurance. Deterrence had worked, but only narrowly. The system had survived its first true test by inches rather than margins. Leaders on both sides recognized that survival had depended on restraint, luck, and incomplete information. From that recognition emerged arms control. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and later agreements all carried the imprint of early espionage failures. Verification became central, inspections became necessary, blind trust became obsolete. The spy's legacy thus extended into diplomacy. He had demonstrated that secrecy alone was insufficient, that without transparency mechanisms, power would always leak. Inside intelligence communities, his case became a cautionary tale. Training manuals emphasized behavioral analysis over ideology. Loyalty was redefined not as political alignment, but as consistent conduct. Counterintelligence shifted focus from loud dissenters to quiet insiders. The paradox was clear. The most dangerous threats rarely announced themselves. Yet even these reforms could not undo the past. The Cold War nuclear arms race continued, fed by momentum and mutual suspicion. Warheads multiplied far beyond any conceivable military necessity. Entire generations lived under the assumption that annihilation was a policy option. The spy had believed balance would bring peace. Instead, it brought endurance. As years turned into decades, the human cost of this endurance became apparent. Resources diverted to weapons were unavailable for development. Proxy wars erupted across continents. Nuclear accidents narrowly avoided catastrophe.
Each near miss reinforced the fragility of the system. Historians would later argue that the Cold War was won not by strength alone, but by restraint. That restraint, however, was enforced by terror, and terror required parity. The spy's personal story, meanwhile, faded further into obscurity. He did not live to see the Cold War end. Records suggest his final years were quiet, unremarkable, and medically uneventful. No death notice appeared in Western media. No acknowledgement followed. His anonymity was complete. Yet anonymity did not equal insignificance. Every arms control negotiation, every verification regime, every intelligence reform carried echoes of his actions. He had exposed the vulnerability of secrecy itself. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the nuclear standoff dissolved, but the weapons remained. New nations inherited old arsenals. Proliferation fears replaced superpower rivalry. The lessons of early espionage became more relevant, not less. If a single individual could alter global balance once, it could happen again. In this sense, the spy never truly vanished. He became a precedent, a reminder that history is not only shaped by presidents and generals, but by individuals operating unseen, guided by belief, conviction, and opportunity. The Cold War ended without nuclear fire, but it had been forged in invisible hands.
When the Cold War officially ended, there was no ceremony for the habits it left behind. Walls fell, flags changed, treaties were signed. Yet beneath these visible shifts, the deeper structures of fear, verification, and mistrust endured. Nuclear weapons did not disappear with ideology. Intelligence services did not suddenly relax. The world had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The spy who vanished belonged to an earlier chapter, but his influence extended far beyond it. In the 1990s, as archives opened and historians gained limited access to once forbidden files, a new generation of analysts revisited the origins of nuclear parity. Their work revealed an uncomfortable continuity. Many of the assumptions guiding post-Cold War security policy were direct descendants of early espionage failures. Verification regimes became stricter. Information sharing became conditional. Scientific openness, once celebrated as a universal good, was filtered through layers of national interest. The spy's legacy was no longer confined to history. It had become infrastructure. Nuclear security in the modern era was built on one foundational belief: trust must be engineered. This belief shaped everything from arms reduction treaties to international inspections. Satellites monitored test sites, sensors tracked seismic activity, inspectors counted warheads and verified dismantlement. None of this existed during the Manhattan Project. The absence of such mechanisms had allowed a single individual to tilt the balance of power. Modern systems were designed precisely to prevent that kind of asymmetry. And yet, the paradox remained. The more complex the system, the more potential points of failure it contained. Intelligence agencies adapted by shifting emphasis from secrets to patterns. They no longer asked only what information had been stolen, but how behavior evolved over time. Long-term anomalies mattered more than ideological declarations. Quiet consistency attracted more attention than vocal dissent. The spy's case became instructional. He had demonstrated that loyalty could not be measured solely by belief or affiliation. It had to be observed in conduct, context, and continuity. Even then, certainty remained elusive. Espionage thrives on ambiguity. In academic circles, debates resurfaced with renewed urgency. Was scientific secrecy compatible with global survival? Could humanity afford to restrict knowledge that determined its own extinction? Or was restriction the only safeguard against misuse?
These questions echoed the moral conflict that had once shaped the spy's decisions. He had acted in a world without frameworks for shared nuclear governance. His choices, however flawed, were responses to that vacuum. Modern institutions attempted to fill it, yet proliferation fears intensified. As more nations pursued nuclear capability, the original fear that had motivated espionage returned in altered form. Balance between two superpowers had given way to instability among many actors. The logic of deterrence became harder to sustain. Intelligence agencies warned that the greatest threat was no longer state espionage, but diffusion, knowledge spreading incrementally through networks of cooperation, commerce, and research. The spy's methods seemed almost quaint by comparison. He had relied on memory and trust. Modern threats relied on systems. Still, history refused to let him disappear entirely. Occasionally, a document would surface, a memo referencing an unnamed source, an assessment hinting at guidance received from within, a Soviet report praising the efficiency of early breakthroughs without explaining why. Each fragment rekindled speculation. Who exactly had he been? Why had he never been exposed? And what did his success say about the limits of power? The absence of definitive answers frustrated historians but fascinated the public. In popular culture, he became a symbol, sometimes romanticized, sometimes demonized. Fiction blurred with fact. Myths flourished where records failed. But professionals understood the danger of myth. The truth was more unsettling than any legend. He was not extraordinary. He was ordinary and competent, and that made him effective. The ultimate lesson of his story lay not in espionage, but in humility. Nations build systems believing they can control outcomes. They classify, restrict, surveil, and guard. Yet systems are built by humans, and humans bring belief, fear, and judgment into every structure they inhabit. The spy exploited not weakness, but normalcy. He trusted that institutions would prioritize function over suspicion, progress over paranoia. He was right. As the 21st century advanced, nuclear policy shifted again toward risk reduction rather than dominance. Hotlines, confidence-building measures, and multilateral agreements sought to manage escalation before it began. These efforts acknowledged a reality shaped decades earlier. The world could not afford another foundational imbalance. The spy's story, when viewed across time, reveals an uncomfortable continuity. From the first atomic secrets to modern cybersecurity threats, the core challenge remains unchanged: how to protect knowledge that defines power without destroying the openness that creates it. There is no final solution, only adaptation.
By the time the world entered the 21st century, nuclear fear had become strangely abstract. The sirens were gone. The drills faded into memory. Younger generations inherited a world shaped by deterrence, but rarely confronted by its immediacy. Nuclear weapons still existed in vast numbers, yet their presence felt distant, locked behind treaties, protocols, and diplomatic language. This distance was deceptive. The structures that managed nuclear power were still built on assumptions forged during the Cold War, assumptions born from betrayal, secrecy, and irreversible loss of trust. The spy who vanished had not merely altered a balance, he had forced the creation of a permanent architecture of caution. And architectures, once built, rarely disappear. Scholars analyzing nuclear history increasingly framed the Cold War not as a conflict of ideology, but as a prolonged crisis of information. Each side feared what the other knew, suspected what it might be hiding, and planned for outcomes it could never verify. Espionage did not simply provide data, it reshaped imagination. The spy's greatest influence may have been psychological.
By proving that the most guarded secrets could be penetrated from within, he ensured that uncertainty would forever accompany power. No deterrent could be absolute if knowledge itself was vulnerable. In reassessing his actions, historians confronted an ethical paradox. Had he acted later, after arms control mechanisms existed, after verification regimes matured, his behavior would be unequivocally condemned. But acting early, in a world without such safeguards, complicated judgment. He did not destabilize an existing balance, he created one. That balance, however, came at extraordinary cost. The nuclear arms race consumed scientific talent that might have transformed medicine, energy, and space exploration. Instead, brilliance was redirected toward perfecting annihilation. Entire academic disciplines oriented themselves around secrecy rather than discovery. The spy's belief that shared knowledge would reduce suffering collided with a reality in which shared fear defined survival. Former intelligence officials interviewed in retirement often returned to the same uncomfortable conclusion: the system had invited its own violation. The Manhattan Project and its successors relied on trust layered atop urgency. They assumed that loyalty could be inferred from gratitude, that those rescued from tyranny would naturally defend their sanctuary. This assumption ignored the complexity of belief. The spy did not betray America because he hated it. He betrayed it because he believed no nation should wield unchecked power. That belief, while morally arguable, proved strategically catastrophic. The absence of a reckoning haunted the intelligence community. Captured spies could be studied, interrogated, and learned from. Their mistakes informed countermeasures. The vanished spy offered no such closure. His success forced agencies to learn from inference rather than confession. This uncertainty became institutionalized. Training emphasized humility. Analysts were taught to assume blind spots. The myth of total control was quietly abandoned. Security evolved from absolute prevention to damage limitation. That evolution continues. In public discourse, nuclear weapons receded behind new threats: terrorism, cyber warfare, climate instability. Yet the frameworks developed in response to early espionage found new applications. Cybersecurity mirrored nuclear security in unsettling ways. Knowledge was power. Systems were vulnerable from within. The most damaging breaches often came not from external assault, but from trusted access. The spy's story echoed in every insider threat briefing. As nations grappled with emerging technologies, the original dilemma resurfaced in altered form. How much knowledge could safely be shared? Where did openness end and vulnerability begin? Who decided? The nuclear age had forced humanity to confront these questions under existential pressure. The answers were imperfect, provisional, and shaped by fear. They still are. The spy himself, reduced now to a case study rather than a character, seemed almost irrelevant against the magnitude of what followed. Yet history does not move independently of individuals. Structures are built in response to actions. The world of verification, deterrence, and managed mistrust did not arise naturally. It was constructed in reaction to a specific failure, one person exploiting a moment when knowledge outran governance. In the end, the spy did not steal America's nuclear secrets alone. He stole its certainty, the belief that power could be contained, the belief that loyalty was visible, the belief that secrecy was sufficient. Those illusions never returned. What replaced them was a colder, more cautious world, one that survived not through innocence, but through restraint. Peace became a negotiated condition rather than a natural state. Stability required constant maintenance. The nuclear age did not end the moment the Cold War did. It persists in policy, psychology, and precaution. the vanished spy remains unnamed not because history forgot him, but because history absorbed him. He became part of the foundation, a warning embedded in protocol, a silence behind every locked door. The story that began with stolen equations and whispered explanations did not conclude with exposure or justice. It concluded with transformation. Humanity learned too late and too expensively that the most dangerous secrets are not those that explode, but those that change how power understands itself. And once that change occurs, there is no return.
In the decades following the Cold War, the vanished spy's influence became more abstract, yet no less profound. Nuclear treaties multiplied, multilateral inspections became standard, knowledge was cataloged, digitized, and controlled with unprecedented rigor. Yet beneath these layers of organization and oversight, the same fundamental lesson persisted. Knowledge is never neutral, and those who control it shape the world far beyond immediate perception. The spy had understood this intuitively. He had not sought fame nor reward. He had acted in a domain where his intellect mattered more than allegiance, and his judgment mattered more than ideology. And by acting, he forced an entire generation of governments, scientists, and strategists to reconsider assumptions previously taken for granted. The subtlety of his influence is revealed in the way nuclear strategy evolved after his disappearance. Military planners became obsessed with redundancy. Multiple layers of oversight, dual-key launch systems, and independent verification were implemented to ensure that no single individual could alter outcomes again. Intelligence analysis shifted toward behavioral patterns over ideological declarations. Risk assessment became probabilistic rather than absolute. Contingency planning became endless. Every innovation in nuclear governance was a response, in part, to the realization that even highly trained institutions could be outmaneuvered by a single individual. The spy's disappearance left psychological as well as strategic consequences. For decades, every official facing classified operations asked themselves, what if our understanding of loyalty is flawed? What if the trusted insider knows more than we do? What if history repeats itself? Training manuals across agencies adopted scenarios where quiet, competent individuals, appearing unremarkable, introduced the highest-level threat. Case studies of espionage shifted focus from ideologues and saboteurs to the subtle influence of insiders. The spy's success was neither spectacular nor violent. It was, instead, profoundly educational. Meanwhile, the historical record remained fragmentary. Researchers pieced together names, dates, and transmissions, but gaps persisted. Redacted documents hinted at operations without confirmation. Soviet-era archives praised efficiency and foresight without naming sources. Memoirs recalled colleagues who disappeared at just the right time and never re-emerged. Each fragment suggested mastery, planning, and moral conviction, but offered no definitive resolution. By the late 20th century, public understanding of nuclear espionage relied heavily on dramatization. Films, novels, and documentaries portrayed him as a ghostly figure, a man who walked through walls of secrecy unseen. Some accounts exaggerated his cunning, others underplayed his impact. Yet professional circles understood that mythology could never fully capture his significance. He had changed systems, not just outcomes. The spy's philosophical legacy became apparent in academic discussions about knowledge management, organizational security, and ethics. Scholars debated whether any system could ever be fully secure if human judgment remained fallible. His story became the foundation for modern studies on insider threats, risk perception, and decision-making under uncertainty.
Business schools, defense academies, and policy institutes referenced him implicitly, teaching that intelligence is as much about understanding human behavior as it is about acquiring information. Despite decades of distance, the Cold War-era consequences persisted in global policy. Deterrence, verification, and arms reduction were not just political tools, they were mechanisms engineered to counteract vulnerabilities exposed in the past. Every inspection protocol, every safeguards procedure, every classified review board carried echoes of a single individual who had demonstrated how fragile even the most secure systems could be. The spy's personal morality remained enigmatic. Had he believed that parity would prevent war, or had he underestimated the cascading effects of his actions? Did he consider the suffering his indirect influence would generate? Archival correspondence suggests contemplation, but not self-aggrandizement. He wrote sparsely, often abstractly, and never in a manner that revealed regret or pride. He acted on principle, with the understanding that principle alone cannot guarantee safety or justice. The absence of clear moral resolution mirrors the ambiguity of the nuclear age itself. In essence, the story of the spy is the story of modern security, a continuous negotiation between trust and verification, between knowledge and control, between human judgment and institutional procedure. One man's choices forced the creation of systems designed not to prevent war outright, but to manage fear, suspicion, and the unknowable. The spy vanished physically, but his presence permeates every decision made under the shadow of annihilation.
By the early 2000s, the world had entered a post-Cold War era, but the lessons of the vanished spy remained alive in policy, doctrine, and institutional memory. Nuclear strategy had evolved from the rigid doctrines of the 1950s and 1960s into multi-layered systems of checks and balances. Decision-making was no longer solely centralized. Redundancy, oversight, and verification became inseparable from the very concept of national security. Yet beneath every protocol lay a quiet acknowledgement: no system is flawless, no procedure can account for every variable. Individuals, like the spy decades earlier, could still alter outcomes in unforeseen ways. It was a lesson that continued to define the very architecture of modern intelligence. Analysts and historians began reassessing the human element in the story of nuclear espionage. The spy's career, though largely invisible to the public, had revealed fundamental truths about risk and trust. A single competent individual, moving with discretion, could shape global events. The consequences of human action, the archives suggested, were as consequential as technological capability. His absence forced reflection not just on what had been stolen, but on how knowledge itself is valued and guarded. In quiet offices of Washington, Moscow, and London, analysts debated scenarios derived from his methods. What would a contemporary insider threat look like in the era of cyber warfare? How could digital access be as tightly managed as physical access? How could human judgment be incorporated into algorithms and systems designed to anticipate anomalies? In essence, his lessons transcended decades and mediums. The principles that had governed his espionage applied equally to nuclear security, digital defense, and organizational trust. Meanwhile, the moral dimension of his story persisted. Had he acted rightly? Could one justify violating one nation's security to maintain a perceived balance of global power? Was parity a form of prevention or provocation? Scholars argued endlessly, often without resolution. Ethics, like history, is rarely neat. The spy forced reflection on uncomfortable truths, that human choice, even when guided by principle, carries consequences beyond calculation. One person's reasoning could reshape economies, provoke crises, and redefine the parameters of war and peace. The spy himself remained enigmatic.
Records suggest he spent his later years living quietly, avoiding recognition, refusing public engagement. There was no memoir, no revelation, no redemption narrative. The secrecy that had defined his professional life persisted in his personal life. To historians, this absence is telling. He neither sought glory nor forgiveness. His disappearance was complete, but his impact endured. In this, he epitomized a paradox of the nuclear age. The most influential actions often leave no trace in the visible record, yet resonate through decades of policy and thought. As the new century progressed, international crises, near misses, and technological advances continued to test the structures his actions had indirectly shaped. Cyber intrusions, rogue states, and global proliferation concerns all echoed the lessons of the early nuclear age. Institutions that learned from the spy's impact invested heavily in monitoring, verification, and resilience. Insider threats, both human and technological, became central to strategic planning. The invisible hands that had shifted balance decades earlier remained a guiding consideration. Public memory, however, did not always align with institutional memory. To the general population, the spy remained a ghost, an almost mythical figure referenced in films, books, and documentaries. Popular narratives often romanticized his intellect, dramatized his courage, or simplified his impact into caricature. Yet the reality was far more nuanced. He had been competent, deliberate, and principled, but also subject to the ambiguities and consequences of a world he could not fully control. In truth, the spy had demonstrated that even extraordinary human agency operates within larger systems, constrained and amplified by circumstances beyond one's own perception. By the end of Batch 10, several themes emerge. 1. Influence over recognition. The spy altered global outcomes without public acknowledgement. 2. Trust and verification. Institutions learned the fragility of systems dependent solely on assumed loyalty. 3. Ethical ambiguity. Principle and consequence rarely align neatly in decisions of global consequence. 4. Enduring legacy. The Cold War structures, policies, and doctrines owe part of their existence to his choices. In sum, the spy's story is a meditation on the interplay of human decision-making, institutional response, and the unpredictable consequences of knowledge.
The 21st century introduced complexities that the vanished spy could hardly have imagined, yet his influence remained deeply embedded in global security culture. Nuclear proliferation expanded beyond the familiar superpower duopoly. New nations sought capability, some in secret, others openly. International organizations scrambled to maintain verification mechanisms, building layers of inspection, oversight, and reporting that mirrored the lessons extracted from early espionage failures. The spy's legacy had transformed from a singular act of theft to a structural principle. The world must operate as if any system, even the most secure, could be penetrated by human ingenuity. Analysts often reflected on this principle in seminars, simulations, and classified briefings. What would he do became a recurring question in evaluating potential vulnerabilities. This abstract inquiry was less about moral judgment and more about operational awareness. He had demonstrated that competence, discretion, and timing could produce effects far exceeding direct authority. Understanding that lesson became critical to every generation of intelligence officers and policymakers. In retrospect, the Cold War's most subtle wars were fought not only with bombs, but with knowledge. Information became currency, and trust became both a weapon and a liability. Every decision, from the design of nuclear warheads to the structuring of international treaties, was influenced by a silent awareness that the boundaries of secrecy were porous. Every system designed to protect, paradoxically, contained its own weaknesses. The spy's success exposed these vulnerabilities, prompting a reevaluation of how nations conceptualized power itself.
His personal choices also reflected a complex moral calculus. Unlike others who had engaged in espionage for ideology, wealth, or revenge, he operated in a space defined by principle and foresight. Archival fragments suggest he believed that enabling a balance of power would prevent catastrophic dominance by a single nation. Yet the consequences of his actions extended far beyond his intent. The arms race intensified, geopolitical tension escalated, and national security protocols became more elaborate. The principle that guided him intersected unpredictably with institutional rigidity, technological innovation, and global politics. This intersection demonstrates a central truth. The outcomes of human decisions cannot always be predicted, even by those most intelligent and careful. As global crises emerged, from regional conflicts to technological threats, the invisible hand of early espionage echoed. Institutions designed to withstand compromise became foundational to modern governance, both civilian and military. Policies regarding secure communications, personnel access, and threat detection drew upon lessons first revealed decades earlier. Insider threat programs, risk analysis frameworks, and emergency protocols were direct descendants of the recognition that a single individual could reshape the strategic landscape. By the early 2000s, the world's response to uncertainty was institutionalized, yet individual ingenuity remained a wild card. The vanished spy story also offered a lens into the human dimension of history. While treaties, doctrines, and systems endure, they are ultimately designed and implemented by humans. Bias, judgment, and belief remain unavoidable factors. The spy's actions, deliberate and careful, revealed the consequences when human understanding intersects with high-stakes systems. Scholars in organizational behavior and ethics frequently cite his example, demonstrating that intelligence is as much about human perception as it is about technical capability. In this way, he became a case study not only in espionage, but in decision-making under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Public perception, however, has always been partial and fragmented. The vanished spy's name remains largely unknown outside professional circles. Popular culture has dramatized his exploits, often conflating fiction and fact, creating a figure at once heroic, cunning, and morally ambiguous. Yet these narratives obscure the more profound reality. His impact was structural, systemic, and enduring. The absence of publicity does not diminish significance. It emphasizes the nature of influence exercised quietly, invisibly, and without recognition. By the time historians and analysts began evaluating the long-term consequences of Cold War espionage, the spy's role had become emblematic. He represented both the potential and the limits of individual action within large, complex systems. His work highlighted a persistent tension. Knowledge empowers, but it also imposes responsibility and risk. Even today, strategic planners reflect on these lessons when designing nuclear protocols, digital security frameworks, and emergency protocols. In essence, his choices underscore an enduring truth. The consequences of a single person's actions ripple far beyond the immediate and visible.
As the 21st century unfolded, the spy's story became less about individual heroics and more about the architecture of power and knowledge he had inadvertently shaped. The Cold War had long ended, yet the systems his actions had influenced continued to define international security. Nuclear strategy, intelligence protocols, and organizational vigilance all bore the imprint of one man's choices, a man who had vanished physically but whose legacy permeated every layer of policy and precaution. The profound lesson of his disappearance is clear. Influence does not require visibility. Actions executed with precision, discretion, and foresight can ripple across decades, reshaping not only institutions, but also the mindset of generations who inherit them.
Governments continued to build and refine safeguards, multi-layered verification systems, real-time monitoring, global intelligence sharing, and intricate contingency planning. All of these frameworks acknowledge an uncomfortable truth exposed decades earlier. No system is invulnerable to human ingenuity. One individual, operating silently and without recognition, could still alter the trajectory of global events. The spy had proven this fact, and the world's response to it became the foundation of modern strategic thought. Ethically, his story remains complex. To some, he was a hero, preserving balance and preventing dominance that could have led to unthinkable outcomes. To others, he was a traitor, destabilizing a fragile system and unintentionally fueling decades of nuclear escalation. Yet the enduring truth is more nuanced. Human actions exist within a matrix of consequences, intended and unintended. The spy's motives were principled, his execution disciplined, and his impact profound. But morality in the context of global nuclear strategy is rarely absolute. History, in this case, is neither black nor white. It exists in shades of gray, defined by the tension between intention and outcome. The spy's disappearance also forced institutions to evolve. Counterintelligence practices became more sophisticated, focusing on behavior and patterns rather than ideology alone. Insider threat programs, human reliability assessments, and multi-tiered security clearances emerged as critical components of protecting high-value information. These practices, now standard, originated from the recognition that an individual's capabilities could outpace assumptions, a recognition first validated by his actions decades earlier. In the academic realm, his story became a case study in risk, decision-making, and ethics. Organizational theorists examined how seemingly ordinary individuals could influence complex systems. Political scientists analyzed the ripple effects of trust, secrecy, and vigilance. Security professionals traced modern protocols directly back to the lessons embedded in his choices. Across disciplines, he became an enduring example of the interplay between human agency and systemic resilience. For the world at large, his story remained largely hidden. Popular culture occasionally dramatized his actions, but the real significance was structural, invisible, and enduring. The spy had altered not only the immediate balance of power, but also the mechanisms by which humanity manages existential risk. Peace, deterrence, and stability in the nuclear age were now understood as fragile constructs, constantly maintained through vigilance, verification, and the recognition of human fallibility. Ultimately, the spy did not need recognition. His legacy is measured in outcomes, systems refined, doctrines reshaped, and an enduring awareness that the human element cannot be ignored. Knowledge, once acquired, alters the course of events. Trust, once breached, reshapes institutions. The vanished spy's actions are embedded in the architecture of the modern world, and their influence will continue to be felt as long as nations seek security in a universe defined by uncertainty. As history reflects on the Cold War and the dawn of the nuclear age, one figure remains central, not because of fame, but because of effect. His story teaches that invisibility does not equate to insignificance. That principle guides contemporary policymakers, intelligence analysts, and scholars alike. And it reminds humanity that even in the vast machinery of geopolitics, individuals matter. One decision, executed with intelligence and foresight, can reverberate across decades, shaping the fate of nations and the course of human history. In the end, the spy who stole America's nuclear secrets and disappeared did more than steal information. He exposed vulnerabilities, tested assumptions, and reshaped the understanding of power itself. His story closes not with a trial, a confession, or a public reckoning, but with the enduring lesson that knowledge is power, discretion is influence, and human agency remains the ultimate variable in the architecture of history. The world he left behind is cautious, structured, and vigilant, forever aware that even the most secure systems are only as resilient as the people within them. And though his name may never be spoken aloud, the invisible legacy of his choices persists, guiding decisions, shaping policies, and reminding all who manage knowledge that the unseen hand often wields the greatest power.
Discover the real American history. Hit subscribe. Watching from Facebook, follow the page so you never miss a single historical story again.